Oh, hey guys, it's the VC Industry Critiquer here with another oldest versus median versus newest. Sorry it's been a little while, guys. I had to go through a bit of therapy from being forced to sing the I Love You song by Murray. Yeah, I'm gonna have to take a little break from that flyaway prank I like to play on him. Whew. You know, I always used to think that video making would be a simple ordeal. Find a movie to talk about, post it online, and get super rich from it. I was wrong. That is video posting. Video making is a completely different matter. I should know, that's what I've just been through. And it's a lot like how parents find out that a wedding is actually a lot more complicated than just a marriage. But like the wonderful videos I produce, it's almost always worth it in the end. Well, keep in mind the word almost always. And fittingly enough, that just happens to be the theme of this video. Yep, I'm of course talking about Father of the Bride. It's the story of a middle-aged man with a different name in all three versions, whose daughter has returned from college and reveals the scariest words any parents could imagine from their child. They're dropping out of college and becoming a full-time YouTuber. Wait a second. Oh, sorry, it's actually the second scariest words any parent could imagine from their child.
I'm engaged. I'm engaged, I'm getting married.
He and his wife are naturally dumbfounded, but they try to be happy for her sake. Plus, the groom does seem like a nice enough guy, if a little bland. But the father soon discovers, like I revealed in the intro, that getting married and having a wedding are pretty different things, and the second one is a lot more complicated. And since apparently only the bride's parents fund weddings while the grooms get to be cheap assholes, the father soon finds himself swarmed with bills needed to provide an acceptable wedding for his girl, and his family won't hear of any attempt he makes to cut corners. The financial stress gets to our dear daddy more and more, until he realizes something insane. He's actually not upset about the expensive wedding. Well, okay, yes, he totally is. But the big reason he's such a wreck right now is the fact that his little girl isn't, well, his little girl anymore and is going out into the world. But can he come to accept this in time for the big day? So yeah, as I'm sure you can tell by the really short recap, this isn't an especially elaborate story. There's no antagonist, conspiracy, or even plot twist here. It's just a simple little tale of a parent having to let their child grow up that's been told countless other times in media, especially by Disney. But a wedding is one of the most difficult and relatable parts of this difficult parenthood phase, and honestly not told in media as often as you'd think. So that's why I feel the story is so relevant even after all these years. From its beginning as a novel by Edward Streeter in 1949, and getting a film adaptation the very next year, and another 41 years later, and another one 31 years after that, this time with a predominantly Cuban cast. But of course we have to ask, which of these three versions best captures the emotional phase that most parents have to endure in their lifetime? Well, let's walk down the aisle to find that out. This is oldest versus median versus newest, Father of the Bride. So what better way to start off this Father of the Bride comparison than by looking at the Father of the Bride, the character who represents fathers everywhere and the anxiety they have to go through on one of the biggest days of their lives. But which incarnation pulls that off the best? Well, let's find out with Best Father of the Bride. In the role of the titular father of the bride, we have Spencer Tracy, Steve Martin, and Andy Garcia respectively, and like said before, has a different name in each version, namely, no pun intended, Stanley Banks, George Banks,
and so the person that we need to mold the breed is
no, not that George Banks. There we go, and Billy Herrera. Okay, let's start with the one I like the least, and sad to say, that would be Andy Garcia's Billy Herrera. Make no mistake, Andy Garcia is an awesome actor, especially in Ocean's 11, and he does great as the tight-ass control freak who wants everything to go his way or the highway that the character is. My problem is, though, is that he has so little of the traits that made said father such a relatable and sympathetic protagonist. For one, there's virtually no scenes of him stressing over the financial burden of the wedding. Now granted, this may have been changed due to concerns that portraying a Cuban man as cheap would be seen as racist, and early in the movie, it seemed like they were going to have the father and daughter reverse attitudes, where the daughter wants everything simple and cost-effective, and the father wants everything extravagant and expensive.
I don't want to get married with 200 strangers I haven't seen in, 10 years? Plus, I barely know half your cousins.
I barely know half my cousins. Well, what better situation than to reconnect with them at a family wedding?
Hell, unlike the first two movies, the groom's parents actually offer to help cover part of the wedding, and he refuses.
I am the father of the bride, and I will be paying for the wedding, and I'm going to be walking my daughter down the aisle.
And I was like, okay, this could be interesting. He's a guy who wants everything big and isn't paying attention to his daughter's wishes for simplicity. Kind of a role reversal remake. I could get into this, but there's barely any other scenes of this that follow afterwards. Another new plot point is that the father's implied to not like that his daughter's fiancé is Mexican. Okay, so they're adding an overcoming racism aspect as well. That's a neat guess who's coming to dinner spin on the story. And Spencer Tracy played the father in that movie, so I guess it's fitting here. But they barely do anything with that either. But my biggest problem with Garcia was, he just seemed like the least stressed about having to let go of his daughter. It's clear he loved her, but I just didn't feel they had as strong of a connection as they did in the other two movies. If you want to underplay the cheapskatery of the character, that's one thing, but underplaying his stress over having to let his daughter grow up is quite another, and honestly makes him less sympathetic. So I guess the reason I didn't like Garcia's character much was because there really wasn't much of a character to begin with. Now granted, there is a subplot where he and his wife are preparing to get divorced and struggle to keep it from the family until the wedding, and the movie actually does do a decent amount with this, but it's not quite enough to save face, unfortunately. Okay, so now we're down to Spencer Tracy and Steve Martin. These two much better capture the stress the character has to go through with paying for a lavish wedding on a middle-class income and having to come to grasp with his daughter growing up. But you guys are probably going to flood this video with angry comments after I say this, but I didn't feel Tracy's connection to his daughter was as strong as people build it out to be. It definitely felt stronger than Garcia's, but it still just felt a little lacking for some reason. I just felt like Tracy's stress was more because of the expensive wedding.
Just for the cake.
Broken down that way, he said the cost of each reception unit comes to $3.75.
A couple?
A head.
Hell, he even tried to sweet-talk his daughter into eloping just so he wouldn't have to deal with the expenses.
Well, it's just an idea, you know. Forget about it. I'm coming, Ellie.
Yeah, it kind of hampers the impression of a father fearing empty nest syndrome. Martin was definitely stressed over the money as well. Hell, maybe even more than Tracy was, but the median went out of its way to show that his stress was more on account of having to let his daughter go. When his daughter first announced the news of her engagement, he was borderline insulted by the news.
You meet an unemployed, amazingly brilliant non-ape that I'm gonna have to support. You're not getting married, and that's it, and that's final. And I don't like you calling me George. I mean, when did this start?
And I guess that's fitting, because Martin definitely has a very charming and believable bond with his daughter here. And unlike the other two movies, we see them do more in this version than just prep for the wedding, like play basketball together. So you can totally see why Martin is so devastated about his baby bird flying away from the nest. And on top of that, while all three versions are tight asses, Steve Martin just has this comedic charm to him where, even when he's an asshole, he's a hilarious asshole. Especially in the scene where he throws a fit in the supermarket over the classic controversial packaging of hot dogs.
Well, they're not ripping off this nitwit anymore because I'm not paying for one more thing I don't need. George Banks is saying no!
Who's George Banks?
Me!
I can't decide which overreaction is funnier, this or Walter White throwing a tantrum over hellfire raining on his car. Tracy and Garcia had some funny moments, sure, but they just don't have that natural comedic gene that Martin has, so their tight-assery just wasn't quite as fun to watch. Again, I love all three actors, they gave great performances, but Garcia just had so little of what made the character complex and relatable, and Tracy didn't have quite enough of the most important / sympathetic part. Steve Martin nailed everything about the character, and combined with his natural comedic charm, he definitely made the most funny and emotional father of the bride. Point goes to the median.
Now, I've heard all about this. I care to hear. Now, stop it. Stop it.
Why is it every time I come here, I am the bad guy?
But of course, the movie isn't just called Father, it's called Father the Bride. And said bride is much more than just the secondary protagonist. She represents that little baby bird everywhere that parents have to let fly out the nest eventually. So let's see which incarnation captured said baby bird's flight pattern best with Best Bride. The bride, called Kay, Annie, and Sophia respectively, is played by Elizabeth Taylor, Kimberly Williams Paisley, and Adria Arjona respectively. And I'm sure this will surprise none of you, but my favorite of the three is Elizabeth Taylor. Not necessarily because she's the only big-name actress of the three, or one of the most charming actresses in all of Hollywood, although both those factors did indeed help, but let's look at who the bride is. Basically, this character is Daddy's little girl all grown up and getting married. So I feel the best way for us to sympathize with what the father is going through is for us to see his daughter the way he does, and Elizabeth Taylor definitely had this natural, little girlish feel to her.
Well, I really don't know yet, Mother. It all depends on Buckley's plans. Maybe months, maybe a few weeks, or maybe any time at all. We can't tell yet. Sneaking off and getting married, well, I feel sort of, well, as if something were wrong. As if you didn't like Buckley and didn't want me to marry him.
See what I mean? I can't quite describe it, but even as a young adult, Taylor just seemed to have that, well, cutesy Shirley Temple vibe you'd usually find in 8-year-old girls. Yeah, that shit quickly went right out the window.
Who's afraid of Virginia Woolf? Virginia Woolf, Virginia Woolf.
But point still remains, here I think she perfectly captured how the father is viewing his daughter. You know, maybe that's why The Simpsons creators had her voice Maggie for her first word. Kimberly and Adria's brides are good too, being spunky and strong-willed gals.
And I'm not gonna lose my identity with him because he's not some overpowering macho guy. He's like you, Dad. Except he's brilliant.
He's smart and he's sweet and he listens and he's constantly trying to surprise me, but he does this thing where he bites his lip every time he's trying to hide something.
And again, I love spunky and strong-willed women, and I suppose their portrayals do work in a way too, namely to show the father that their kid is all grown up now and can fend for themselves. But given the premise of the story, I really do think Taylor's work's the best because it really helped us empathize with the father all the more since we could see what he was seeing. As for their writing, the only difference I really think is worth talking about is why she gets angry at her fiancé and temporarily calls off the wedding. Cause apparently that's a required cliche in all love stories, and it's so forced here I think it only lasts about, maybe 5 to 8 minutes in each version. Anyway, let's look at the reasons now. And the median is because he bought them a blender for their house, and since blenders are often associated with 1950s stay-at-home housewives, she thought he was profiling her misogynistically. Look, I am a liberal feminist and I won't stand for sexism, but I was kinda snickering at this. I mean, Annie, it's a blender for God's sake. People have them in their houses. Just because he bought it for your house doesn't mean he thinks you're a Stepford wife. Yeah, grow a spine, kid. In the newest, she calls off the wedding because she finds out that her fiancé had found out about her parents getting divorced and hid it from her. Okay, maybe that's a little more understandable, but his heart was clearly in the right place. He clearly kept it from her the same reason her parents were keeping it. He didn't want to take the joy out of the biggest day of her life, and I feel Sophie should have realized that. And the oldest is because he decided on his own, without talking to her whatsoever, that their honeymoon was going to be a fishing trip in a cabin in Nova Scotia. Now that is outright pig-headed sexism. He wasn't thinking about his fiancé or something they both would enjoy for their honeymoon, he was just thinking about what he'd enjoy, i.e. putting himself first. And I'm sorry, but you don't do that in a marriage, especially on your frickin' honeymoon. Again, maybe a little harsh to break off the wedding, but I do feel Taylor's reason was the most justifiable of the three. Another thing that helped was Taylor was also the youngest actress of the three. Where Williams Paisley was 20 and Adria Arjona was 29, Taylor was barely 18, the minimum legal required age for marriage, so I guess that helps make it all the more scary for the father to let his baby bird go so young. Speaking of baby birds, is it just me, or does Elizabeth Taylor look an awful lot like Kessie from Winnie the Pooh? Yeah, I don't give a shit how old you are. You remember that episode with Rabbit and the baby bird from childhood, don't you dare deny it. Anyway, my point is, seeing how the ending of said episode is very similar to the ending of this movie, that's another big advantage in Taylor's favor. Again, all three brides are fun and memorable, but Taylor's I find the best. She just allowed us to see the character how the father saw her, allowing us to sympathize with him more, was the youngest of the three, had the most understandable reason for the call off the wedding cliche, and, well, was frickin' Elizabeth Taylor. A pretty tough act to follow indeed. Point goes to the oldest.
What is wrong with you?
You get to call the shots.
But of course you can't have a bride without a groom, unless of course both parties are lesbians, but they are not in this case. Well, in any case, can the groom live up to the one in Lisa's wedding, or will he be as bland as the pre-season 10 Simpsons episodes? Well, in any case, he does have his family to back him up with this round, so let's take a look at Best Groom and In-Laws. I know I probably should have put the in-laws in the supporting cast round, but since I conveniently happen to like both the groom and his family in the same version, I decided to merge the categories together. Then, if I did devote a round just to the groom, it would be a bit short because, well, let's just say the groom is no Hugh Parkfield from Lisa's wedding. Respectively called Buckley, Brian, and Aiden, the groom is a fairly nice guy like stated before, but also pretty bland, underdeveloped, and surprisingly lacking in screen time. I guess he's kind of like a pre-Little Mermaid Disney prince, though time will tell how the remake will handle that prince. So I guess the way to determine the winner is which of these three bland romantic leads is, well, least bland. Well, if I had to choose, and of course I do, I'd have to say Aiden in the newest. He does have a bit of personality as a lovable dweeb, and on top of that, he seems to have the strongest connection with the bride of the three.
Just feel sorry for someone who has no choice but to fight for money, you know?
Would you like me to change the channel?
No.
No.
This is your house, please. No. You have truly raised the best daughter in the world. She inspires me every day to be a better man. I want to learn from her. I want to be like her. So nothing would make me happier than to have your blessing to marry your daughter, sir.
Granted, all three couples seemed like a nice fit, but there's just something about Aiden's feelings for Sophia that felt, well, a bit more charming. You can really tell this dude loves her and is going to be a loyal and devoted husband till death do they part. Still not convinced? So another reason why the father is a little opposed to the marriage in this version that I probably should have mentioned earlier is after said marriage, these two plan to return to Aiden's home country of Mexico to pursue careers at a non-profit law firm aiding refugees traveling from America to Mexico. That's very heavily implied to give them both a dog shit salary. So naturally, Billy is less than thrilled that this dude is going to lead his daughter to living a less than extravagant lifestyle and tries to drop the hint to him that, well, he needs to encourage this girl to find a job that'll pay them both the wages of Selena Quintanilla. So I guess that's another advantage he has, namely that he interacts with the father the most in all three versions, where he only interacts 2 to 3 times in the first 2 movies. But then at the end reveals something surprising.
It wasn't my idea to go back to Mexico. No, I love New York. Knowing who I was, I could be myself.
So why are you going back to Mexico?
She found a job that mattered to her there.
What about you? New York, your career, your own plans.
My plans are to figure out a life next to your daughter.
That is what I call a husband. He gave up all his dreams and a chance at a richer lifestyle for the woman he loved. Dan, if I have a kid, I hope they choose someone like you. Again, sorry I haven't really talked much about Buckley or Brian, but there's just so little for me to. I will admit though, Brian is a bit of a dweeb himself, so I guess he has a little more personality than Buckley, but he's just kind of your run-of-the-mill dweeb than a charming one, so it's not saying much. I do like Buckley's hairstyle though. Okay, that's really all I got for the grooms. Now on to their parents. Now the groom's parents are polar opposites of the bride's. They're chill, pleasant, and pretty accepting of the fact that their son is grown up and getting married. But which one is the best? Well, one big advantage the oldest has is that the groom's mother is played by frickin' Glinda from The Wizard of Oz, or more appropriately, her actress Billie Burke. So yeah, this really helped her come off as a chill, warm lady.
Oh, do please call us Doris and Herbert, not Mr. and Mrs. Dunstan. Just follow the yellow brick road.
Sorry, I couldn't resist. But with that said, the first 2 movies barely do anything with the in-laws, and their characters aren't really explored as much as I feel they should have been. And the newest, well, that's another story. Not only do they have the most screen time and meaningful involvement with the story, but their more laid-back personalities are expanded on here. Here they're portrayed as lively, eccentric billionaires who just love life and want to live it fuller than anyone's ever lived it before.
Momento no éramos nada. Ahora somos familia. Así es. I wouldn't really consider this house small.
I don't mean it's more like small. I mean it's more like my guest list alone is 500 people.
500.
These kids, they spent 4 years in America, and suddenly they are gringos. What do you expect, mijo? That I'm gonna be a guest at my own son's wedding?
Yes!
Plus, they're more developed, where the groom's parents are divorced just like the brides are secretly planning to get, and the father's new wife can't be more than half his age. That's pretty frickin' hilarious. But more importantly, he and his ex seem on much more pleasant terms than Billy and his wife are, and those two are still married. By the way, if you're wondering, yes, Billy and his wife called a divorce off, and I think seeing how happy these two were even when they were divorced played a part in it. And like I said before, they actually offered to pay for part of the wedding, albeit so they can have some of their own ideas for it as well as Billy's. But still, they weren't being frickin' cheapskates and were willing to help pay their fair share of it. So yeah, since the newest groom and his parents had the most screen time, involvement with the story, personality, and most of all charm, newest gets the point on this one. Point goes to the newest.
I was selfish and pig-headed. I was stupid.
It was incredibly insensitive of me.
With the score all tied up, let's now remember that you can't pull off a wedding for your kid all by yourself. You need as much support as possible, and there certainly is a lot of that in this story, but sadly not towards the father having anxiety over having to let his kid grow up. But in any case, let's take a look at Best Supporting Cast. I suppose we should start with the wife, respectively called Ellie, Nina, and Ingrid. Unlike her husband, the mother of the bride is a bit more accepting of the fact that their daughter is actually grown up and getting married. Sure, a little nervous like most parents would be, but she's not having both hilariously corny and also surprisingly terrifying nightmares about the wedding going horribly wrong for her like the father is. So let's start with the one I like the least, and like the father, that would probably be Ingrid in the newest. Granted, she does probably have my favorite line in that version.
What is all this Sharks versus Jets shit? We're all sharks here!
But I guess my big problem with her is, look, I get these two are not going to have as strong as chemistry as in the first two movies since they decide at the start that they're getting a divorce, but Ingrid just seems so unnecessarily cruel to Billy throughout the movie.
You expect me to sleep on the couch?
Only until the wedding's over. Then you can get your own place. Hi, David. Can't talk right now. Well, when can we finally meet to discuss divorce proceedings? Because I can't take this one more second. Thank you.
I honestly don't see why these two were even married. They seem to connect as well as, well, Sharks and Jets like she mentioned before. Sure, she's pretty supportive towards her daughter, but the way she treats the father kinda got on my nerves a bit. Okay, so now we're down to the oldest and median again. Both have much stronger chemistry with the husband than Ingrid, but I think I like Nina a little better. She just seemed a little more naturally chill and pleasant than Ellie did, making her a better contrast to the more emotionally wrecked father, but at the same time, seemed to have a slightly stronger and more charming connection with him, kind of like the father and daughter in the median. Plus, the scene where she tells George in prison that he needs to get his shit together for their daughter's sake is pretty epic.
I will stop making faces in general, and I will definitely stop telling everybody I meet how much this wedding is costing.
Don't tell everyone how much it costs.
He told you, right?
250 a head?
How about the bride's younger sibling, or siblings in the case of the oldest? Well, none of the three, or again maybe four, incarnations really offer much to the story, but Maddie in the median is played by, well, frickin' Kieran Culkin, and as I'm sure you know, Kieran could almost be as enjoyable as his brother Macaulay.
Maddie, you're up pretty late, aren't you?
Yeah, I know. I'm just practicing. I wish I didn't have to walk Mom down the aisle.
Hey, don't worry, you'll be great.
Is it right together left or left together right?
Actually, who needs young Macaulay? His brother may have been even more charming than he was. Plus, he does have somewhat of a purpose in the story, so I'll go more into this in the next round, but George has to clear all the wedding cars off the street since he didn't actually file a permit for them. So he lets Maddie and his best friend Squint from the Sandlot clear them out, and of course the two 8-year-olds drive the cars perfectly fine. Hey, it's still more of a purpose than in the other two movies. And of course, there's the character that everyone remembers, at least in the median, the wedding planner and his sidekick. And yes, of course this goes to Martin Short and B.D. Wong, no contest. For one, the wedding planner is barely in The Oldest, and even in the time he has, he's pretty forgettable. Hell, I remember his cake more than this guy. The wedding planner in The Newest, played by Chloe Fineman, is pretty memorable though.
Do you have a business card?
No.
Where are your offices?
Aki.
I thought you said she had experience.
She came highly recommended.
The point is, it's always the same, right? The parents want to preserve their traditions and their kids don't. Tale as old as time. And I relate. You know, I wanted a Sex and the City theme for my bat mitzvah, and my parents wouldn't let me.
I'm a Charlotte.
I'm a Samantha.
And as I'm sure you guessed, I love how they flip the genders of the planners in The Oldest and make the planner female and the assistant male, which brings even more diversity to this already diversified retelling of the story. But as fun as they are, they still don't even hold a candle to Short or Wong. Yeah, these may be both actors' funniest performances ever.
Uh-oh, hello! That's 5 months. 5 months, not much. But that don't bother me so much because it's a little bit tight, but we can do it and it will be spectacular.
Parking attendants, 4 is comfortable, 3 is acceptable. Anything less absolutely terrifies me. 2.
George.
2.
What about... Wait, that's really about it. Actually, not quite. I do like how we see the extended family of the bride in The Newest, but they really don't have much to offer personality-wise. Billy's card-playing buddies are pretty funny, though. But since the median did all the primary side characters the best, median will take this point. Point goes to the median.
It's gonna put out somebody's eye. You should be ashamed of yourself.
And now we've come to the big final round. Which movie best told this tale over how, even if your kids are growing up and going out into the world, you won't have their love, fly away, don't... I'll shut up. This is Story for the Win. Like said before, I feel the reason this story has always been very popular despite its simplicity is because it's a great showcase of an experience that so many people go through in their lifetime. Having to let go of your kid is rarely easy for a parent, and this film really captures that experience, basically letting parents know that they are not alone with the process. But which version captures that the best? Well, I'm gonna have to go with the crowd on this one. That would be the Steve Martin median. For one, it just seemed like the most timeless version. As excited as I was to see a Hispanic retelling of this tale with The Newest, being a diversity lover and all, there was surprisingly not as much focus on Cuban or Mexican culture as you'd think. There definitely was, don't get me wrong. Hell, there's even a pretty funny scene where the wedding planner assumes they'll want flamenco dancers at the wedding, and Billy points out that flamenco dancing originated in Spain, not Cuba or Mexico.
The point is that this is not cultural appropriation. Rather, cultural celebration.
Nah, you were racially stereotyping, but there was still not as much of it as I was hoping for. Instead, The Newest felt a bit more like an HBO soap opera reimagining of the story, which isn't necessarily bad because The Newest is an HBO Max original, and soap operas are fine, but they do have a somewhat limited audience. And The Oldest was definitely a product of the 50s. From Stanley and Ellie sleeping in separate beds despite being married, to the only black characters being in low-level jobs, to Kay and Buckley traveling by train instead of plane. Hell, just the name Buckley, isn't that a 50s name or what? The writing and setting of the median seemed pretty timeless for the most part, like it could have easily taken place in any time period of the three. But the bigger reason I like the median best is because, like said before, this story's about a dad having to come to grips with his kid growing up, and the median gave us the best focus on that. We see the father having many nostalgic trips back to when she was younger and growing up throughout the years, and they're all really moving. Hell, just look at the scene when she first tells him the news of her engagement.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Dad, I met a man in Rome, and he's wonderful and brilliant, and we're getting married.
Let's be honest, what father hasn't had that happen to them when their daughter first tells them they're engaged? Thought so, and his interactions with her in present day are just as heartwarming. Now don't get me wrong, the father in the other two versions did have some sweet interactions as well, but like said before, they just didn't feel as heartwarming to me. My point is that the media understands that the father's relationship with his daughter is the most important part of the story, so it gives it the focus it needs. Plus, it seems to have the father suffer the most in this version. Yeah, George gets attacked by Rottweilers, falls into his in-laws' pool, has his clothes ripped in public, gets arrested. Okay, so he brought literally all those things upon himself, but nonetheless, he has quite an unpleasant experience with this whole wedding ordeal, making us feel for him all the more. And sure, Spencer Tracy, the oldest, suffered a lot himself. Hell, just look at this, very interesting nightmare he has about him being late for the wedding and everything going to hell. Yes, it's hilariously corny, but you still really feel the father's anxiety during the scene. And Billy, well, again, he did not suffer too much in this version, but he did still have to deal with divorce on top of the issue of having let his girl grow up and get married. That couldn't have been pleasant. But on the whole, I feel that Martin suffered the most. Let's look at the ending, for example. So all three movies end with the father and daughter having a sweet farewell, but look at each version what leads up to that. Fate works out perfectly for Billy. He gets to be with his daughter for a lot of the reception after the wedding, they have their sweet goodbye, he and Ingrid reconcile, and it's happily ever after. Like said before, the ending of The Oldest and Median are very similar to the classic Pooh episode with Kessie. Another emotional story about a father having to let his daughter grow up. The father wants to see his daughter throw her bouquet and say goodbye to her, but despite his best efforts to reach her, he ultimately just misses her before she leaves. He's crushed about it, but then the daughter calls him and reveals she'd never leave without saying goodbye to him. Both endings are sweet, but the Median was the one that moved me as much as that Pooh episode did when I was 5 years old, and I think this is why. Fate was just so cruel to Martin during the scene when he's trying to see his daughter. He has to clear 200 cars off the street in 30 minutes, he nearly slips on the ice outside, and all the people and furniture just feel like they're deliberately sent his way to keep him from getting to his daughter in time. And The Oldest, the crowds and furniture don't feel as much like they're a deliberate obstacle for Stanley, so I don't know, I was still pretty sad when he missed his daughter, but because Martin felt more bullied by fate with the event, that made the scene where his daughter calls him as sweet as with Rabbit and Kessie. And I just want to emphasize, I did still enjoy all three versions. They're pretty entertaining movies and do have heart, but the one with the most heart and laughs in my opinion is The Median. The primary reason being that it had the best focus on the father's anxiety with the upcoming empty nest syndrome, thus making it the best film of the three. Point and victory go to The Median, the most emotional tale of a father and daughter bond.
Unforgivable.
I think you should take a step back, Pop.